And just as important, all of you who were brave enough to show up to hear about the world's scariest monsters direct from the safety of wherever you're watching this from. My name's Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter for this program. And although my background's actually in the field of psychology, for the last 25 years, I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampires over in Transylvania, looking for the Loch Ness Monster, crop circles, UFOs, reports of alien abductions, really weird people, odd places, you name it. If it's just strange and a little offbeat, I've traveled around the globe in search of these oddities. And for this program, I put together some of the scariest monster legends from around the world that I've traveled to investigate. So for the next 45 minutes or so, we'll take a tour of all these monsters where I'll give you the background, the folklore, the eyewitness accounts. I'll talk a bit about some of the research I've done on these things. Heck, I'll even provide you with the direction to some of these in our neck of the woods. But I'm going to leave it up to each and every one of you to go to these places on your own and determine for yourself whether or not you believe these creature stories are true. So with that, let's explore some of the scariest monsters on our planet. First up, Transylvania in Romania. Spent some time over there looking for legends and lore of vampires. Now, what's interesting about Romania is Transylvania is a county in Romania, and many parts of Romania are very primitive in terms of agriculture and the like, where they look like the U.S. would have looked hundreds of years ago. And when I was there, I was staying out in the middle of nowhere. People still, pardon me, there we go. People still horse and buggy. I was staying out in the middle of nowhere, spending the night when I needed to get some supplies for the next day. And in order to get the supplies, I had to go through the woods to get to town. It was only about 2 miles away. And when I first started walking through the woods, it was getting dark and I thought, this is amazing. I'm in Transylvania. The moon's out. This is wonderful. But your mind starts to play tricks on you in these adventures where all of a sudden every branch breaking was Vlad the Impaler coming up on his, horse and buggy, or a werewolf sharpening its claws. And I ended up running to town, getting the supplies, and then running back as fast as I could. And part of it was just the atmosphere, because over there, they see vampires a little bit different than we do here in the United States. Here in the United States, our vampires are all supermodels who glow or twinkle in the sunlight. I mean, I don't know many people who wouldn't want one of these vampires to come and visit them. But in the old countries, they see vampires as more of this type of creature. Very hideous, not very intelligent, often dressed in their burial rags, dirty, looking bloody where they chewed off their own mouth or their lips trying to get human flesh. And I think they're also closer to death in a lot of locations. When I was traveling through Romania, I'd often see cemeteries where the bones were out and being washed. Talking to some of the caretakers, they told me they would often wash the bones as a sign of respect for the dead. A lot of communities often go out of their way to avoid their loved ones coming back as a vampire. They may actually bury a brick in the mouth of the loved one so they could not come back as a vampire. Other cultures, including here in the United States, would often bury people that they were afraid of coming back. They would bury them face down into the ground. So if that person woke up and tried to escape, they would start digging, but they wouldn't dig their way out. They would dig their way farther down into the ground. We have cases of it happening all over here in the United States. But in places in Romania, they still talked about staking the loved ones down as a vampire. Not necessarily to kill the person, but to literally stake them to the ground so they couldn't come back. Many places would often have their loved ones decapitated, and they would bury the body separately from the head. Therefore, if one rose up, the other one would not be there. And in very rural areas, I heard legends and lore of people being cremated, but the family in the village would not stop there. They would take the cremated remains, grind them up into a fine powder, and make a soup out of that powder, and the entire community would consume the soup, thereby spreading out the power of that person so they could not come back and haunt you. But you don't have to head to Transylvania for vampires. In fact, my home state of Wisconsin has tons of stories of vampires, mainly Mineral Point, Wisconsin. It all began in the 1980s when this police officer, John Pepper, was patrolling late at night. He passed by the Graceland Cemetery here when he saw in the cemetery what he described to be a very tall, very pale, very thin, very ugly vampire, complete with a cape. Officer Pepper chased that vampire to the edge of the cemetery, where he said it flew over the side and disappeared into the night. Now, Officer Pepper did not want to report this because he knew how it sounded, but he was on duty. He had to make the report. And as you can imagine, media from all over the world descended upon Mineral Point looking for that vampire. Soon after the case went public, dozens of people started calling the police, claiming that vampires were jumping out at them from everywhere in Mineral Point. It got to be so much that the police officer, Officer Pepper, quit the police force and moved away, refusing to talk about the case ever again. Now, I don't know if the police chief really believed his story or was having fun with the semantics, because in the last paragraph, you can see that he said he was offering his officers overtime to stake out the place, but none of them would bite on his offer. Again, maybe just having fun with the semantics. Now, I've been to Graceland Cemetery both day and night many, many times. I've never been attacked by a vampire. But then again, I keep my vampire hunting kit with me whenever I go to a suspected vampire hangout. As you heard earlier, I did spend some time on a couple expeditions over to Loch Ness in Scotland. Perhaps the most infamous creature is that of the Loch Ness Monster. On one of my expeditions, I'm the one in the blue coat here without the really cool beard. I spoke with this captain who told me he had been giving tours daily of the loch for nearly 20 years looking for Nessie. He had 2 sightings in all those years that he could not explain. One was when he was coming right near shore, finishing up a tour, when something brushed up against his boat that seemed to be bigger than the boat he was on, and then it descended into the water and vanished. Every year, people still see stuff they can't explain in Loch Ness. There's even a 24-hour video camera you can watch over the loch, and you can see it and what's happening and take a photo if you so choose. What I found fascinating about a lot of these places I traveled to is a lot of them were beacons for paranormal activity. For instance, the last time I was at Loch Ness, I ended up getting more reports of UFOs hovering over the water than I did about the Loch Ness Monster. But again, you don't have to head to Scotland for lake monsters or sea serpents. In fact, you can go to the Mississippi River. Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, people were terrified of the Mississippi River. Parents would not allow their children to go swimming in the river because there were newspaper stories of giant river monsters living up and down the Mississippi River. The newspapers claimed that these creatures were 9 feet long, 200 plus pounds, covered in a thick scale-like armor that a bullet could not even pierce. And then people really became terrified when they started finding that many men mostly would drown in the Mississippi River. And they blamed it on these man-eating fish because when they would pull the bodies of the men out, they found deep scratch marks or claw marks on their calves and ankles as though something grabbed them and pulled them out and drowned them. And then a few years later, the newspaper said, don't worry, it's okay. We solved this case. You can go back to the Mississippi River. It's just a couple alligator gars swimming around. No big deal. Well, that's all well and good when you don't know what an alligator gar looks like. But when you see that this is a garfish, it's a little different story, because if you're swimming and the 9-foot garfish swims up against you, you're going to think it's a sea monster. And in fact, it is. It's just one that we happen to know about. But if you follow the Mississippi River for a bit, you'll eventually come to Lake Pepin. It's a lake on the Mississippi River dividing Wisconsin and Minnesota. They believe something bigger and much more deadly is living in the lake than a couple alligator gar. The first tales tell of native peoples taking only their strongest and sturdiest canoes out onto the water, because every time they went out or drowned or capsized, it was blamed on the hideous monster of Lake Pepin. When the steamboat captains came up, they too saw these giant leviathan of the deep in the water. When the white pioneers finally settled the area permanently, they started writing about these incidents in the newspapers. Here's one from 1871 talking about the creature being somewhere between the size of an elephant and a rhinoceros, and it could move with great rapidity through the water. We have newspaper accounts dating back to the Civil War about a monster in Lake Pepin. And over the years, not only have people believed they've seen it, some believe they've captured photographic evidence of it, including this photograph that was snapped near Maiden Rock, Wisconsin, shows what appears to be a long neck and a 20 to 30 foot partially submerged body behind it. A few years ago, a man was out fishing with his buddies, and they saw what appeared to be a log moving upstream against the current. They thought it was odd, so they motored their boat over there. When they got there, they realized it wasn't a log at all. They had seen something else. They snapped a photo of this creature, which they believe shows a long neck, hump-like creature, much like you might consider the Loch Ness Monster. Now, I've been on numerous expeditions to Lake Pepin. A couple years ago, I spent many days and nights living on a houseboat with noted researcher Noah Voss. As you can see, we had underwater cameras, we had sonar, we had fishing equipment, we had nets, we even jumped in using ourselves as bait. But unfortunately, Peppy, as it's affectionately known, did not make an appearance. But my favorite part of this story is that the people of Lake City, Minnesota, are so convinced that Peppy is real, or at least convinced that you'll come looking for it, that they are now offering a $50,000 reward for the capture of this monster. As of today, nobody has claimed that reward. And with the weather we're having this year, you could probably get up there this weekend, capture Peppy, and be back $50,000 the richer. But when you travel the world, sometimes stories are even creepier and more bizarre than lake monsters or sea serpents. One such case is that of the woman named La Llorona. Many Central and South American tales of her tell that she was a mother who lost her child on the side of a river or a lake, and that she often appears at night on the water or walking the shoreline looking for her lost child and trying to find that child and cursing anybody who gets in her way. These stories vary from place to place. When I was in Belize, the story they told about La Llorona was she was this beautiful woman that would appear along the side of a riverbank and try to lure men into the woods. And if they went into the woods, she turned into this giant serpent-like creature and would attack them and devour them. When I was there, they offered a tour for La Llorona. It was a midnight tour. The only way to see her was to sign up for this crocodile hunting tour, looking for crocs in the river. And it's midnight, and you're out there in a rickety old canoe looking for La Llorona. And when I was out there, I was so terrified. I don't know if I was more afraid of seeing La Llorona, who never showed up that evening, or all the crocs along the riverbanks, because if you just tilted a little bit, this shoddy canoe was going to go over, to the point where I even said to the person I was with, if you're too afraid and you have to go back, I won't hold it against you, hoping that they'd say, yes, let's get out of here. But they didn't. And luckily, La Llorona did not devour us that evening, knock on wood. Now, most people, if they've heard of a scary monster, probably have heard of Bigfoot, known throughout the world by many names of Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Yowie, the abominable snowman, Sasquatch. And often people think of these cases as only happening in the western states and the heavily forested area of the US. But one of the most intriguing Bigfoot type cases happened down in southern Illinois along a place called the Big Muddy River in Murfreesboro, Illinois. They call it the Big Muddy River because it's big and it's muddy. You certainly wouldn't want to be swimming in it. And the story really gained international attention back in 1973 down at Riverside Park. Two young folks were parked in their car enjoying the beautiful scenery of the river when all of a sudden a terrible smell came into their vehicle. And then they heard a growl, ear-piercing growl, and looked up and noticed a creature seemingly coming out of the water caked in mud, a light white or grayish color creature that was caked from the waist down in the river mud. Some of the descriptions had it looking like this, with these weird pointed ears, very large, 7 to 9 feet tall. They immediately hightailed it out of there, went down to the sheriff's department, and made a report. Officers came back looking in the woods. They still could smell while they were there. They also heard a growl while they were there looking through the mud. They found several footprints in the mud. Now, these might not look like footprints, but when you stick your foot in the mud and pull it out, it makes like a suction and comes around, making this little slat like indentation in the mud. What was interesting is that while they were searching, one officer heard a growl from the creature, dropped his revolver, and left and refused to go back for it. It wasn't until a few hours later that they finally collected the courage for him to go back and grab his pistol. That was something that wasn't made public at the time, as you can imagine the terror of a monster scaring a police officer away from his weapon. And most people think that's the start of the Big Muddy Monster. But while working on the Big Muddy Monster book I had done with some colleagues, I discovered that the story goes back much further in history. Here's a case from 1949 talking about a reward of $100 offered for this mysterious creature. And then, just as people in Murfreesboro were believing it was safe to go outside again, in 1988, Mr. Ryman here had an encounter of his own. He owned a junkyard on the outskirts of town here, and he had been having trouble with teenagers coming in and stealing tape decks out of his cars. So he hired an off-duty officer as a security guard. And they had the plan that if anyone was coming into the junkyard, they would call one another and have backup, and they would confront the intruders together. And one night, officer on duty noticed something big moving in the back of the junkyard. So he called Bob up, and together they went out looking for it. And as they walked back, they saw something big moving against the trees and the car liner. And then they saw its glowing eyes. And this thing was gigantic, and it was moving back and forth, just staying out of their view. They were terrified of it. It seemed to be mumbling something in an incoherent language, mumbling to itself as it moved back and forth. The officer pulled his gun out, and he was going to shoot it. And Bob said, "No, don't shoot it, because if you shoot it, it might just make it mad. We don't know what this thing's capable of." So they started backtracking to their shed. And they made their way to their shed, and they tried to get it to go under a light, a motion light. But it sensed it, and it would not go. So they locked themselves in their shed here, and they waited. And while they were waiting, they started noticing that boulders started hitting the side of the shed, very loud rapping and banging on the shed. And Bob said he didn't think the creature was trying to break into the shed, because it easily could have busted through, but instead it was just trying to terrify him. Finally, when they left for the night, the next day they found strange footprints all over the outside of the area. Again, you don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to take Bob's word for it. You can take your own word for it by going there and checking out the big muddy river yourself. I just recommend you don't go swimming in it. You'll come out looking like a mud monster of your own. This next character, creature, folklore, legend, spirit, whatever it is one of the oldest North American legends. It's also one of the least known. It's a creature that you might not want to say its name. It's a creature you certainly don't want to run into. Of course, I'm talking about the creature called the Wendigo, the winter cannibalistic monster of the North. It began as a First Nation creature with the First Nation people of Canada. It was known by many names and many variations of its spelling. For the people of northern Minnesota, they believed this thing was a harbinger of death, that if you saw it or heard it, much like seeing or hearing the Irish banshee, it meant you or someone you know was going to die very shortly. And sure enough, those who saw the Wendigo often ended up dying. The creature was thought to be somewhere between 8 and as long and high as it wanted to get. Some explain that it was even taller than the treetops, and it could make itself as big as it wanted. Often very thin, skeletal looking. Sometimes it's missing its own mouth, lips, and face because it's chewed it off in its insatiable hunt for human flesh. The most terrifying aspect of the Wendigo is the fact that it could possess you. We have hundreds of cases in Canada where people killed one another believing that that person was turning Wendigo or going Wendigo. And of course, usually they'd be arrested for it when the white government claimed that it was murder, not self-defense. But most of the people willingly went to trial saying, if we wouldn't have killed this thing, it would have infected the entire community, village, or tribe, and we'd all be dead. We had no choice but to kill it. And again, you can go to Canada looking for it, or there are many places in the US where you can still see encounters of the Wendigo. Way up in northern Minnesota is the small speck of a town called Ross. Today, there's not much there, but back in the 1800s, there were lots of people living there. Let me see if I can, I don't have it on here. We'll skip back to this one. So there were a lot of people living in the area, and they believed a Wendigo was moving throughout that area with Jake Ross and his journal. We'll get back to that story in a bit, because they weren't the only ones to notice this weird, monstrous Wendigo lurking. If you go just east of Bemidji, you'll come to a place called Lake Wendigo. It's a lake on an island in a lake, which makes it an anomaly in its own right, featured here in Ripley's Believe It or Not cartoon. You can see here, the island of Star Island is thought to be haunted. There have been several books written about the legends of the ghost of Star Island. One of my favorite stories tells of men going out with their wives to the island, and they set up base camp. The women started cooking, the men went into the woods to hunt for game. And when the men never came back, the women went looking for them, found them hung up in a tree, skinned, dead. They left the island immediately, claiming that it was a cursed island. They would never set foot on that island again. The bodies of those alleged men have never been found to this day. Others claim of finding giant holes in the ice of Lake Wendigo, where the Wendigo seemingly came out of the water and walked to the island as though it was searching for prey. So back in the winter of 2015, I joined my colleagues Kevin Nelson with the beard there and Noah Voss as we made our way to the lake to see if we could conjure up the Wendigo. You can't tell from this photo, but that's me there in the middle. The reason you can't tell is it's about 30 degrees below zero with the wind chill, as we had to hike our way, carrying all of our gear for several hours to get to the island. I'll give you a quick taste of what that was like.
Is that real? Are they actually doing it?
It's a video he took of them. Yeah.
There. Now, many believed, hold on, microphone's acting up. Let's go back here. Can you still hear me? Perfect. Many believe the lake itself is the Wendigo. And while we were there, my colleague Noah on the left of the screen there, here he is, Noah and I were going to spend the expedition in our tent. But my colleague Kevin Nelson on the other side, here he is, he wanted more of an adventure. So he decided he was going to spend the expedition in his hammock out in the 30 degree below zero weather. First thing we had to do was get a fire going, not only for warmth, heat, and light, but we had to keep our tallow hot. Tallow is a beef fat, or any fat of a bear, moose. You can use the tallow. And one of the legends is that you can kill the Wendigo by pouring hot tallow down his throat. Just how you're supposed to pour it down his throat, I don't know. But we had our tallow hot the entire expedition because tallow can melt the Wendigo's icy heart and it will die. Many believe the Wendigo lives in the lake. In fact, parents do not allow their children to swim in the lake because kids have drowned in the lake. So one night when we had a good base camp fire going, Noah and I decided to walk to the middle of the lake to see if we could conjure up the Wendigo. While we were walking, we were recording it. As we were recording, Noah paused for a moment and he said, "Our boots are too loud. Nobody's going to hear what we're talking about because our boots are too much crunching in the snow. So let's be quiet." And while we paused there, something to the left startled us and really caught our attention. Let's take a look.
Okay, see, I'm trying to be quiet for. What is it? Don't have it. Don't have eyes or anything.
Let's take another look at that.
Okay, see, I'm trying to be quiet for. What is it? Don't have it.
Now, most likely it was a big bird of prey or an owl. We didn't see anything. Owls are attached to Wendigo lore in the fact that many believe the Wendigo can shapeshift and often takes the form of an owl. Others believe the owl is an informant, a spy for the Wendigo. But even though we didn't see anything startle us there, it got our adrenaline going for the evening, so much so that my colleague Kevin slept with his axe right next to his hammock just in case the Wendigo showed up. Unfortunately, Kevin did not get eaten by the Wendigo, so I don't have proof that the Wendigo was there. but I'll leave it up to you to visit the spot and decide for yourself. Or if you'd rather learn about the Wendigo through your nice warm home, you can do so with my very new book on the subject as well. In Central America, a few years back, I was over in the jungles in Central America looking for a creature they called the Tata Duende, a diminutive man whose feet are backwards so nobody can track him, even though everyone knows that his feet are backwards. He seems to be a very small man, often wearing a sombrero. Many claim that he'll only have 4 fingers and no thumbs. So if he sees you and he sees that you have thumbs, he'll come and try to rip your thumbs off, which is why you have to do what I did. If you see him out in the woods, you have to just hold up 4 fingers and hide your thumb so he does not come back looking for you. And everywhere we went looking for this diminutive creature, villagers seemed to have a story. In fact, many people I talked to said, "Why are you looking for this creature? We go out of our way to avoid it. Crazy American, what are you doing?" I talked to one gentleman who was the equivalent of a park ranger here in the United States. He told me as a young boy, he had a sighting. He was playing in his backyard when he saw this thing at the edge of his property. It seemed to be singing some type of beautiful song. And without even thinking, the young boy started walking towards the creature who was trying to get him to come into the woods with him. And as he was walking, the young boy said he heard his mother yelling for him to come home and eat. And it snapped the spell. And he started crying and ran home, believing that he had encountered the Tata Duende. But everywhere I went looking for this Duende, villagers said, "You better get home and back to the village before nightfall. Because if you don't get back here before nightfall, you might encounter one of our creatures called hellhounds. They're large black dogs with glowing red or green eyes. They've been reported throughout history in nearly every culture on the planet. Many cultures believe these creatures do the devil's bidding and that you do not want to see one. Over there, they called them cadeos, and they believed these things had supernatural powers, that if they saw you, they would steal your energy and slowly start to drain you. And unless you could find a powerful shaman or a bush doctor to break the curse and cure you, you'd be cursed with bad luck and you'd be dead within a week of seeing these monsters. So being the researchers that we were, we made it a point to stay out past dark every night. And luckily, knock on wood, I'm still here today. But again, you don't have to head to Central America to see hellhounds. In fact, one of my favorite places is right outside of my hometown of Eau Claire, Wisconsin. It's a place called Mary Dean. It's an old island named after a young girl by the name of Mary Dean who drowned while coming up on a steamship, and her body was said to have been buried on the island in an unmarked grave. Many claim she still haunts the river where she met her end. But my favorite part of the story is the dare. And the dare is that if you go, well, maybe let's just take a look at the dare.
I'm here at the boat landing of Mary Dean, where the dare is that if you're foolish enough to go into the water, the vengeful spirit of Mary Dean will try to pull you under, and you'll meet your watery grave and spend eternity in the river with Mary Dean. So I'm going to take this dare right now. No life jacket, no swimming apparel, just me versus Mary Dean. So let's see how this goes.
I know you're all wondering if I survived this or not, but I can tell you, oh, I guess we're going back. So I can tell you that I did survive, obviously.
The spirit of Mary Dean did not pull me under into those dark, churning, cold waters of the river. So another dare completed.
So the story is that she'll act like a siren out in the middle of the water trying to entice you in, saying things like, "I can't swim, Help me, I'm drowning. Legend is, if you're foolish enough to do so, she will pull you under and you'll meet your watery grave and spend eternity in the river. Every year, several people lose their lives by drowning at this very spot, and their family states that they seem to be pulled to that spot for some unknown reason. My favorite part of the story is that you don't have to register, you don't have to pay, you can just camp on the island. Because the legend is that when an entire town lived out on the island, there was a post office there and many, many businesses as well. You'd have to get there by ferry back and forth. And the legend is that one of the men was a doctor and he had a dog, and his dog mauled some children, so his dog had to be put to death. And that has led to the story of the place being cursed by the hellhounds of Mary Dean. These, again, large black dogs with glowing red or green eyes. After a program I did, I talked to a big burly biker guy who approached me. You know, the type of guy you wouldn't think would get spooked by anything. He told me him and his buddies took their motorcycles out to Mary Dean to see the ghostly image of Mary Dean. They had no idea about the hellhound stories. But as soon as they got there, he said they were surrounded by hellhounds. When I asked him why he thought they were hellhounds and not just wild black dogs, he told me several things stood out. One, they were nearly transparent. He could almost see right through them. Two, they had glowing red eyes. And three, no matter how fast they went on their motorcycles, the dogs kept up with them. It wasn't until he went to kick one and his big biker boot went right through it that the creature finally disappeared. He told me they did not stop driving until they hit the safety of Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, which is about 20 miles away. Many people have seen these phantom hellhounds out at Mary Dean. But if you'd rather not go in search of hellhounds, you may want to go for something maybe a little less spooky to most people. And that would be the little people, the gnomes, goblins, fairies, the hidden folk, the sprites, the good people. Names go on and on and on. Now, when I was over in Ireland, I'd walk into a pub and say, where do all the gnomes and fairies hang out? And they'd say, which ones do you want to know about? Try doing that here in the US, you'll probably get kicked out of the pub thinking you're already intoxicated. So I'll save you the embarrassment. If you want to see little people, I suggest you head to Pipestone, Minnesota, to the National Monument. This is a sacred area for many cultures where they quarry to get the stone that they use in their ceremonial pipes. They believe the stone is red, literally from the blood of their ancestors. And the first time I was there, I was staying in Pipestone at the haunted Calumet Inn, a small hotel downtown, beautiful historic place that is thought to be haunted by several spirits of the hotel, including a lady of the night that used to work there when the place was more of a brothel, and one gentleman who lost his life in one of the numerous fires that plagued the hotel. But everywhere I went in Pipestone, people said you have to get out to the monument. Not only did they believe it was haunted, many people would be walking out here and they'd hear the ghostly voice of a woman singing, thinking maybe it was someone who was paying their respects or doing a ceremony. They followed the voice but could never find the origin of it. They also believed the place was inhabited by the little people. So when I walked out there from the Calumet Inn one afternoon, it was a beautiful sunny day. I walked out and I found a spot and I said, if little people exist, this looks like a great spot for them to be. So I sat down under a tree and I put out my offering, or bait, as you will. Now, many cultures believe that when you go looking for these creatures, you have to bring with you an offering, whether it's tobacco, a shiny rock, or some candy, something so you will not be cursed by the little people. So I sat down under the tree and I called out for the little people to make themselves known. Nothing happened, but 10 minutes later, something fell out of the tree into my hair, or at least I thought it did. But when I looked through my hair, nothing, no twig, no acorn, nothing. 15 minutes later, the same thing happened. And then as I sat there, all of a sudden I started getting very tired, drowsy, where I said, if I don't stand up and walk around, I'm going to fall asleep. Perhaps they were trying to lure me into their fairy world. So I walked back to the Visitors Bureau. Now here is where they have their stone carvers, the cultural ambassadors carving their stones and answering questions. I talked to one woman who had been there for 20 years, her mother nearly 40 years, and she claimed that they would often hear the little people rattling pipes in a back secured room, but when they went in, the little people would scatter. She also said the most common thing that happened to her and her mother is they would be carving when all of a sudden it felt like someone tugged on their hair, like a fly landed in their hair. But when they went to look, nothing could be found. They blamed it on the little people playing trickster-like games with them. She told me, whatever you do not go out looking for these creatures. Do not call out to them because they will make themselves known to you. I didn't have the heart to tell her I was just out there calling out to them, but luckily the little people have not cursed me to this day. But moving from what can be considered non-creepy to very creepy, reports of werewolves all over the U.S. Thanks to my good friend and colleague Linda Godfrey, my home state of Wisconsin is now known as the werewolf capital of the world. It all began as Linda was working as a journalist covering stories of people traveling down a small stretch of road called Bray Road, when often at night, but not always, they would see what appeared to be a giant werewolf type creature on the side of the road. Size of a bear, but shaped more like a wolf with this long muzzle and deep, dark, matted down fur. Oftentimes, reports were that it was a biped, moving upright on its hind legs like you and I do. Once Linda's books came out, people from all over the U.S. started contacting me about seeing a weird creature on the side of the road. Sometimes it was eating roadkill or freshly killed prey. But Bray Road's not the only place to see one of these creatures. Right outside of Fort Dodge, Iowa, is a small town called Terra. This is Terra Bridge, or as locals call it, Terror Bridge. They call it that because it's thought to be a cursed area, haunted for many years. Back in the 1800s, the story was that a railroad worker lost his life and was killed working on the railroad. And since that time, many people have seen the ghostly image of a train coming toward them. They can see the phantom lights, they can hear the rumbling, they can feel the vibration, but the train never arrives. They've often seen the ghost of that man who believed was to be a pile driver. I have newspaper accounts dating back to the 1890s talking about the man who was a pile driver was shooting down big rods into the ground, and one struck back at him and decapitated him, and his spirit was often seen over the bridge. Many strong, sturdy, tough railroad men refused to go over the bridge at night because they were spooked by the ghost of this man. But over the years, the stories changed, and the stories morphed and progressed. One of the newer stories tells of a distraught mother who went out to the bridge one day with her children, and she waited and she waited. Eventually, a train came rumbling by, and one by one, she tossed her children over the edge to that train where they met their end. Once they were disposed of, she jumped over and joined them in death as well. And now it is said that when you go there, you will see her ghostly spirit and her kids on the bridge. But the dare is that if you park your car on the bridge and do not lock your doors and windows, the murdering spirit of that mother will try to throw you over to your death as well. Last time I was there, I was with Noah Boss and Kevin Nelson. They were up above. I was down below. Not only did they not stay in their car, they got out looking to move to the side, hoping that she would come out and try to throw them over. They were up on top, hoping that she would try to throw them over, while I was down below filming, praying that she would throw them to their deaths. But unfortunately for me, she did not appear and they survived the trek. But others tell a more sinister story of the area, claiming that around the same time as the story of the railroad worker haunting the place, that the place was inhabited by a werewolf type creature as well. Many people have seen the creature running along the train tracks out in that area. I love the story of the Van Meter visitor. In 1903, the small town of Van Meter, Iowa, was terrorized by a monster of awful form. It began one night when they saw a ball of light over one of the buildings, and the ball of light disappeared and then reappeared on another building in a matter of a few seconds. The next day, no one gave it much thought until the next night, while sleeping above his office, the local doctor saw a light flashing in his room. When he went over to the window to see what was causing it, he looked down and noticed this giant 8-foot bat-like creature. I have to give Dr. Alcott credit. He didn't just look at this thing. He went out, grabbed his weapon, and started shooting at it. Over the next several nights, many people saw the creature in town, including the bank manager, Clarence Dunn, who was actually terrified while sleeping, protecting the bank. He was awoken in the middle of the night by a strange bird-like creature. He blasted at this creature, had no effect on the monster. Several people shot at it. Eventually, after 5 nights of terror, they believed it was coming from the old abandoned coal mine on the outskirts of town. So they gathered together a posse. And as they gathered, this creature flew out from its surroundings and then returned later that night to go back to an old abandoned coal mine. The townsfolk shot at it so many times it was said that they could have sunk the Spanish fleet. But it had no effect on this creature. The creature was impervious to its weapons, and it simply descended into the mine. And that's where the story leaves off. We don't know. The newspaper never said, did they kill it? Did it fly off? Is it still there? Did it become the Mothman of Point Pleasant, West Virginia? We don't know. In fact, you would never even know that there was a mine there. They boarded it up and got rid of it years and years ago. I'm standing on the old entrance to the mine, and you wouldn't even know it was a mine there. There's still modern sightings of this monster that gets reported all the time. But you don't have to take my word for it, because every year on the anniversary of the sightings, they hold a festival for the visitor where you can go and decide for yourself. This year, the festival is September 26th. But as I'm running low on time, I want to share the most common report I receive. And it involves people driving down the road, often unsuspecting, when all of a sudden they see something they can't explain, whether it's a UFO, a ghost, or a monster. So I want to encourage all of you to keep an eye out, because you never know when you might be the next to experience one of these strange monsters. So with that, I wanted to save the last 10 minutes we have for any questions, comments, or stories that any of you might have. If you want more information, my website has more than you could ever want or need. But I hope your adventure doesn't end here tonight after the program. Grab one of my books, go on your own adventure. And when you do, I think you'll discover that oftentimes the scariest thing out there is yourself. So with that, I wanted to open it up for any questions, comments, or stories that any of you might have. I'll turn it over to the host to the library again, and you can either unmic yourself or use the chat room if you want.